He only received a house buried for 17 years of work, but what he found there. Arthur Miller stood before what was supposed to be his reward for 17 years of dedicated work at Granite Crest Mining. His calloused hands trembled as he held the keys his boss had tossed onto the table with a mocking smile. The businessman Sterling Vance crossed his arms, observing the reaction of the company's longest-serving employee. The house he had just handed over was located in an isolated mountainous region of the Blue Ridge Mountains in West Virginia, completely buried by a landslide that had happened 2 years prior. "There you go, Arthur. 17 years of good service deserve a fitting reward," said Sterling, barely containing his laughter. "The house is yours. Clean deed, no debts, everything you deserve for so much dedication." Arthur swallowed hard, staring at the keys in the palm of his hand. At 52, with graying hair and a body marked by hard labor, he had dedicated the best part of his life to that company. He had started as a general helper when Sterling was still a young, irresponsible heir, and had remained loyal even when other employees quit because of late wages and poor conditions. "Mr. Sterling, but the house is—" He began to speak, but was interrupted. "Is what, Arthur? You're not going to tell me you're not satisfied, are you?" The boss's voice grew harder. "Because if that's the case, I can very well cancel your retirement. You know the company's been tight." The worker lowered his head. He knew questioning would be useless and dangerous. Sterling had inherited the mining company from his father 5 years before, and since then had been cutting benefits and firing long-time employees to reduce costs. Arthur was one of the few remaining from the founder's era, and his retirement had been promised years ago. "No, sir, I'm grateful for the opportunity," he murmured, putting the keys in the pocket of his worn-out shirt. "Great," Sterling clapped his hands. "Then it's settled. You have until the end of the month to vacate the company house, and remember, Arthur, keep quiet about internal business. You know how it works." Arthur nodded and left the room, feeling the weight of humiliation with every step. In the hallway, he met Janet, the secretary who had worked there for 15 years. She looked at him with pity. "Arthur, I heard everything," she whispered, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "What he did to you is cowardly." "It's what's on offer today, Janet. At least I have a roof," he replied, trying to maintain his dignity. "But Arthur, you know the state of that house. No one has even managed to clean it after the landslide. They say it's dangerous to even go near it." Arthur shrugged. He had already accepted his fate. For 17 years, he had developed a blind loyalty to the company, always believing his dedication would be recognized. His naive nature made him trust that, in the end, everything would work out for those who worked honestly. When he arrived home, he found his wife Martha preparing lunch. She was a woman of 48, still beautiful despite the worry lines that had deepened lately. She worked as a seamstress to supplement the family income, as Arthur's wages had been late for months. "So, how was the meeting with the boss?" she asked, not lifting her eyes from the pot. Arthur took the keys from his pocket and placed them on the kitchen table. Martha turned around, saw his dejected expression, and immediately understood something was wrong. "Arthur, what is this?" "Our new house," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Martha picked up the keys and examined them. They were old, rusty, with a handwritten tag. 247 Sycamore Drive, Blue Ridge Mountains. Blue Ridge Mountains. But that area didn't have a landslide, yes. Our house is buried under tons of rock and mud. The silence that followed was deafening. Martha set the pots aside and sank heavily into a chair, the keys still in her hand. 17 years, Arthur. 17 years of your life. Her voice began to tremble. And he gives you a destroyed house. Martha, please, please, nothing. She stood up abruptly. Are you going to accept this humiliation? We'll sue that company. We'll fight for our rights. Arthur shook his head. He was a simple man who always avoided conflict. His peaceful and trusting nature made him believe things would work themselves out naturally without the need for confrontation. And with what money will we pay a lawyer? What if he cancels my Social Security? We can't risk it, Martha. Risk it? Arthur, look around. She gestured at the small, modest house where they had lived for 15 years. We hardly have anything left. The late wages, the bills piling up, and now this. The house can be fixed, he said, trying to find hope where there was none. Maybe with a little work. Work? Arthur, it's a landslide. You're not a bulldozer. But Arthur had already made a decision. His stubbornness, a trait he'd had since childhood, was rising to the surface. If the boss thought he would simply accept the situation, he was mistaken. He would go to that house, he would assess the situation, and he would do what was necessary. I'm going there tomorrow, he announced. Alone? If I have to. Martha looked at him as if seeing a stranger. In over 20 years of marriage, she had learned to recognize when her husband's stubbornness spoke louder than reason, and she knew that in those moments it was useless to try to dissuade him. The next morning, Arthur took the bus to the Blue Ridge Mountains. The trip lasted almost 3 hours along dirt roads that snaked through the West Virginian mountains. The landscape was beautiful, mountains covered in deciduous forest, crystal clear waterfalls, the pure mountain air, but he barely paid attention. His mind was focused on the mission he had set for himself. The bus dropped him off at the entrance to the old village where the house was. Immediately he noticed the place was almost a ghost town. Of the 15 houses that existed before the landslide, only 5 remained inhabited. The others had been abandoned after the natural disaster. He walked along the dirt road, checking the address on the key tag. With each step, the scene grew more desolate. Broken fences, gardens overgrown with weeds, windows boarded up. That's when he saw the house, or rather, where the house should have been. In its place was a mountain of stones, dried mud, and wood debris. The landslide had carried part of the mountainside and deposited it right where the building stood. It was as if nature had tried to erase any trace that a home had ever existed there. Arthur stood still for long minutes, trying to process the magnitude of the situation. The pile of rubble was at least 15 feet high and covered the entire lot, which must have been about 500 square yards. "Are you the new owner?" A voice behind him made him turn. It was a woman of about 70, hair completely white and tied in a bun, wearing a simple dress and flip-flops. Her brown eyes showed curiosity and a hint of concern. "I'm Arthur Miller," he introduced himself. "And you are?" "Florence Harrison, but everyone calls me Aunt Flo. I live in the blue house over there." She pointed to a small building across the street. "I'm one of the few who held on and didn't leave after the tragedy." "Did you know who lived here?" "Yes, I did. It was Mr. Lawrence, a retired accountant, a good man, quiet. He lived alone since his wife passed." She paused, studying Arthur's expression. "May I ask why you bought this property?" Arthur hesitated. Telling the truth would mean admitting the humiliation he had suffered, but there was something in the gentle way Aunt Flo asked that made him open up. "Actually, I didn't buy it. I received it as a sort of prize. I worked 17 years at a mining company, and my boss gave me this house as recognition." Aunt Flo looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and compassion. "My son, you do know this house is completely buried, don't you?" "Yes, I know. But..." He looked at the mountain of rubble. "Maybe it can be cleared." The old lady shook her head slowly. "Son, when the landslide happened, government engineers came to assess it. They said it would take very large and very expensive machines to remove all of this, and even then it would be dangerous because the hillside is still unstable. But there has to be a way. Why do you want to recover this house so badly? Wouldn't it be better to sell the land and buy another place? Who would want to buy this?" Arthur gestured toward the rubble. "You're right," Aunt Flo sighed. "Look, if you really intend to try something, be careful. Sometimes it rains heavily around here, and when that happens, the rubble gets even more unstable. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing." Arthur thanked Aunt Flo for her advice and began to walk around the pile of debris, trying to understand the extent of the damage. On the right side, he could see a small piece of the house wall, partially visible between the rocks. It was a sign that the building hadn't been completely destroyed, just buried. That discovery sparked a flicker of hope in his chest. If the house was just buried, and not collapsed, maybe there was a chance to recover it. His stubborn and determined nature began to formulate plans in his mind. He went back to Aunt Flo, who was watching him from her doorway. "Aunt Flo, do you happen to know if Mr. Lawrence had a family? Anyone who might know more details about the house?" "Not that I recall. He was very private. In the last few months before the landslide, he became even more isolated. He spent his days working on something inside the house. People said he was organizing old papers." "Papers?" "Yes. Mr. Lawrence had been an accountant for many years. He worked for a big company, one of those mining ones. When he retired, he brought a lot of documents home, said he was going to organize everything." A strange feeling ran through Arthur's body. Mining. Could it just be a coincidence? "Do you remember the name of the company?" Aunt Flo scratched her head, making an effort to remember. "Oh, my son, it was so long ago. But I think it was something with stone in the name. Stone. Granite Crest." "That's right, Granite Crest." Arthur felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Granite Crest. The same company where he had dedicated 17 years of his life. It couldn't be a coincidence. Somehow his boss knew exactly which house he was handing over to him. "Aunt Flo, when did Mr. Lawrence retire?" "Oh, it must have been about 5 years ago, right after the old owner of the company passed away and the son took over. Mr. Lawrence was very upset with the changes happening there. Sterling, the son who had taken over the company, was Sterling Vance." The pieces began to fall into place in Arthur's mind. Lawrence had worked at Granite Crest, had retired when Sterling took over, and now he was receiving exactly the house where the accountant lived. But why would Sterling do this? Was it just gratuitous cruelty, or was there something more behind it? "Aunt Flo, do you remember if Mr. Lawrence had any problems with the company when he retired?" "Problems?" "Well, he was always grumbling about things that weren't right. He said the new company was doing things his father would never approve of. But I didn't understand much about business, so I didn't pay much attention." Arthur grew thoughtful. A discontented accountant with the changes at the company, organizing old papers before a landslide. And now he was receiving that very accountant's house as a reward for his years of service. More and more, he was sure it wasn't a coincidence. "Aunt Flo, do you think it would be dangerous if I tried to do a little digging, just to see if I can find anything?" "My boy, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're really set on it, at least use proper tools and be careful. And if it starts to rain, stop immediately." Arthur thanked her and said goodbye. He returned to the city with more questions than answers, but with a renewed determination. He wasn't going to just accept the situation. He was going to find out what was really happening. He arrived home in the late afternoon and found Martha in the kitchen, working out the monthly expenses. She looked up when he entered and immediately noticed something had changed in his expression. "How is the house?" she asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Martha, I need to tell you something. The house belonged to an accountant who worked at Granite Crest Mining, at the same company where you work." "Worked? I got my dismissal this morning when I went back to get my things." Martha dropped her pen. "Dismissal? What do you mean?" "Sterling said that since I have a house of my own now, I don't need the retirement anymore. That the deal was the house or the retirement, not both." "He can't do that." "Yes, he can. I never had anything in writing about the retirement. It was just a verbal promise." Martha rose from her chair, her face red with anger. "Arthur, that's enough. That man is playing with our lives. We're going to fight for our rights, even if I have to sell my sewing machines to pay for a lawyer." "Martha, calm down." "Calm down? You worked 17 years. 17 years, Arthur. And he gives you a wrecked house and cancels your retirement on top of it? I know it seems bad, but... Seems? Arthur, this is bad. It's more than bad. It's cruel." Arthur sat down heavily in a chair. For the first time in years, his faith that everything would work out was shaken. But his stubbornness wouldn't allow him to just give up. "Martha, I'm going to get that house cleaned up. With what tools? With what money?" "I'll figure it out. I can borrow from my brother. I can work as a day laborer on other sites." "Arthur, you're 52. You're not a boy anymore to be carrying weight all day. So what do you suggest? That I give up? That I accept that that bastard destroyed our life?" Martha looked at him for a long moment. She had known her husband for over 20 years, and she knew that when he made a decision like that, nothing would make him change his mind. His stubbornness could be frustrating, but it was also what had always kept them standing in difficult times. "All right," she said finally. "If you're determined to try, I'll support you, but on one condition." "What?" "We're also going to see a lawyer, even if it's just to try and secure at least part of the retirement." Arthur agreed. It was a fair compromise. In the following days, he began to organize for the task. He spoke with his brother, Clarence, who worked as a bricklayer, and agreed to lend some basic tools. Martha sold 2 of her oldest sewing machines and managed to gather enough money to buy a shovel, a pickaxe, and other necessary equipment. They also looked for a lawyer in the city. Mr. Victor Bennett was a man in his 50s, experienced in labor law. After hearing Arthur's account, he shook his head in disapproval. "Mr. Miller, what they did to you was an abuse. Unfortunately, without documents proving the promise of retirement, it will be difficult to get anything through the courts. But we'll try." "And what about the 17 years of work?" "Now that we have a chance. If you were fired without just cause, you are entitled to notice, proportional vacation pay, 13th month salary. It may not be much, but it's something." "Doctor, there's something else." Arthur hesitated. "The house I received belonged to an accountant who also worked for the same company. Don't you find that strange?" Mr. Bennett made some notes. "It is suspicious, yes. It could be that your boss has some specific interest in that land. I'll investigate if there were any irregularities in the property transfer." Arthur left the lawyer's office feeling a bit more confident. At least he wasn't completely alone in the fight. A week later, carrying borrowed tools and some supplies, he returned to the Blue Ridge Mountains. This time he was determined to start the excavation work. Aunt Flo saw him arriving and went to greet him. "So you really came back?" "I did. I'm going to try to clear at least a part of the house." "And your wife?" "She stayed in the city working. She needs to keep the family income coming in while I try to sort this out here." "Where will you stay?" Arthur pointed to a small camping tent he had brought. "I'll camp right here, on the property, at least until I can clear the entrance to the house." Aunt Flo shook her head but didn't try to dissuade him. There was something in the man's determination that impressed her. "If you need anything, just call. I can at least offer a hot shower and a decent meal." Arthur thanked her and began to set up his tent on a flat area of the property, away from the pile of rubble. It was early May, and the weather in the mountains was pleasant during the day, though the nights were cold. On the first day of work, he started by trying to identify where the entrance to the house was. Based on the small part of the wall he could see, he calculated that the main door should be about 3 meters to the right. He started digging. The work was much harder than he had imagined. The rubble wasn't just loose dirt, but a compact mix of dried mud, stones of various sizes, and pieces of wood. With every shovelful, he had to stop to remove stones weighing dozens of pounds. After 8 hours of intense work, he had managed to open a hole only 1 meter wide by half a meter deep. At such a slow rate, it would take months to reach the house. Sitting on the edge of the hole, exhausted and dirty, Arthur began to question whether his stubbornness wasn't leading him down an impossible path. His hands were full of blisters, his back ached, and he had barely begun. That's when he heard the sound of a car approaching. It was a modern pickup truck, the kind businessmen often use. Arthur didn't recognize the vehicle, but grew suspicious when it stopped right in front of his property. The person who got out of the truck was Sterling Vance. "Arthur," shouted the boss, feigning surprise. "What a coincidence to find you here." Arthur stood up slowly, wiping his dirty hands on his shirt. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vance. So it's true that you're trying to clear this house?" Sterling looked at the small hole with an ironic smile. "Such admirable dedication." "It's my house now," replied Arthur, trying to keep his voice steady. Of course, it is yours indeed." Sterling walked around the pile of rubble as if inspecting the property. "But tell me something, Arthur. Don't you think you're wasting your time?" "How so?" "Well, look at the size of this mess. It will take you years to clear all this. And for what? To recover an old house that probably isn't even in good condition. If you knew the house was in this condition, why did you give it to me?" Sterling shrugged. "You worked a long time for the company. You deserved a reward. I thought you'd like the challenge." "Challenge?" "Yeah, like an adventure. You've always been a determined guy, right? I thought you'd have fun with it." Arthur felt the anger rising, but he controlled himself. Confronting Sterling openly wouldn't be smart. "Well, thanks for the adventure." "You're welcome," Sterling smiled broadly. "Oh, and if you change your mind and want to sell the land, let me know. I might even be able to find an interested buyer." "Buyer? Yeah, there are people who like to have land in a pretty region like this. To build a country house, I don't know. Of course, the price wouldn't be high because of the current conditions, but it's always something." Arthur grew suspicious. If there were interested buyers, why didn't Sterling sell the land directly instead of giving it to him? How much would it be? "Oh, about $5,000. Maybe 10 if the buyer is really interested." It was a paltry sum for a 500 square meter plot in a tourist region. Arthur realized something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. "I'll think about it." Sure. No rush." Sterling went back to the pickup truck. "But remember, Arthur, sometimes it's better to accept reality than to fight against it." After Sterling left, Arthur was even more intrigued. The visit hadn't been casual. For some reason, his former boss was interested in him giving up the excavation, and that only strengthened his determination to continue. That night, inside the tent, Arthur reflected on the day's events. Sterling seemed too anxious for him to sell the land, and the price offer was ridiculously low. There was something his former boss didn't want him to discover in that house. On the second day, he resumed work with renewed energy. If Sterling didn't want him to excavate, then he was on the right track. Working from sunup to sundown, with only one stop for lunch, he managed to significantly enlarge the hole. By the end of the day, he had found the first encouraging sign, a piece of the house's front door. It was a solid wood door, partially damaged, but still recognizable. From what he could see, it was just blocked by the debris, not destroyed. Aunt Flo appeared in the late afternoon, bringing a homemade lunch pail. "How was the work today?" "Better. I found the house's door." "That's great." She seemed genuinely happy. "You know, I was thinking, if you really manage to get inside the house, be careful with what you find in there." "Why?" "Mr. Lawrence was very reserved in his last days. Some neighbors commented that he was acting kind of paranoid, always looking out the window, as if he was afraid of something." "Afraid of what?" "I don't know, but he changed a lot after he retired. Before, he was a cheerful man, talked to everyone. Afterwards, he became withdrawn, suspicious." Arthur grew thoughtful. A suspicious accountant, organizing papers, afraid of something. And he worked at the same company where Arthur had spent 17 years. "Aunt Flo, do you remember if he had visitors?" "Rarely, but in the last few months I saw some strange people around here. Nice cars, well-dressed people. They weren't the type who usually come to our village." "And what did they do?" "I don't know. They'd drive by slowly, looking at the houses. Sometimes they'd stop and talk among themselves, pointing here and there. I thought it was strange, but I figured they were lost tourists." "When was the last time you saw these people?" "A few days before the landslide." Arthur felt a chill. It would be too much of a coincidence. Strange people investigating the region just days before a natural accident that buried exactly the house of the suspicious accountant. "Aunt Flo, do you think it's possible the landslide wasn't natural?" The old woman looked at him with surprise. "How so?" "Landslides can be triggered, can't they? With explosives or by tampering with the slope's structure. My boy, I don't know much about those technical things, but I can tell you that it hardly rained at all that week. And usually the landslides here happen after heavy rains." Another piece clicked into place in the puzzle forming in Arthur's mind. A suspicious accountant organizing incriminating papers from a company. Strange people investigating the area. A natural landslide during the dry season that buried exactly the accountant's house. And now he, who had dedicated 17 years to that company, was receiving that exact house as a prize. These weren't coincidences. It was a plan. On the third day, he worked with renewed urgency. He didn't know exactly what he hoped to find, but he was increasingly convinced there was something important hidden in that house. Around noon, he finally managed to free the doorknob. It was rusty and stuck, but it worked. The problem was the door wouldn't open. There was debris blocking it from the other side. He began digging a tunnel beside the door, trying to create an alternative passage. It was even harder work, because he needed to shore up the tunnel with planks to prevent collapses. It was during this excavation that he found the first strange thing. Buried among the rubble was a metal box the size of a shoebox. It was partially dented, but still sealed. Arthur cleaned it carefully and brought it out of the hole. It was a waterproof box, the kind used to store important documents. There was a label stuck to the lid, with elegant handwriting, "To whoever finds this, Lawrence Harrison." With trembling hands, Arthur opened the box. Inside were several sealed envelopes, some documents in plastic bags, and a handwritten letter addressed to "Whoever finds this box." He opened the letter first. "If you are reading this, it is because something has happened to me and my house. My name is Lawrence Harrison. I am a retired accountant for Granite Crest Mining. For 32 years, I was responsible for the company's accounting and always sought to do my work with honesty and dedication. However, when the new owner took over the business, I began to notice serious irregularities in the company's accounts. Embezzlement, payments to fictitious employees, tax evasion, and what is most serious, misappropriation of the employees' retirement funds. I tried to speak with Mr. Sterling Vance about these issues, but I was threatened and forced to retire. In recent months, I have noticed I am being watched. Strange cars park in front of my house, people take pictures, and I have already received some threatening calls. Therefore, I am hiding copies of all the documents that prove the irregularities. If anything happens to me, I want the truth to come out and for the company's honest employees to recover what was stolen from them. In the following pages, you will find detailed instructions on where the other documents are hidden. Use them to bring about justice. Lawrence Harrison." Arthur needed to sit down. His legs shook as the truth began to reveal itself. Sterling hadn't just humiliated him with the buried house, he had stolen his retirement and that of all the other employees. With hands still trembling, he opened the envelopes. Inside each were copies of accounting documents, fraudulent contracts, receipts for suspicious bank transfers. It was complete documentation of years of systematic fraud. One of the documents made him stop breathing for a moment. It was a list of employees whose retirement funds had been diverted. His name was there, along with dozens of others. Sterling had stolen millions in retirement funds over 5 years, and the accountant Lawrence had discovered everything. Now Arthur understood why he had received that specific house. Sterling hoped he would simply sell the land without digging, allowing the evidence to remain buried forever. But there was a problem. Lawrence mentioned in the letter that there were other documents hidden, and Arthur needed to find them before Sterling discovered he had found the first box. He carefully stored the documents and returned to the excavation work with renewed energy. Now he wasn't just trying to recover a house, he was fighting for justice for himself and dozens of other workers. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. On the 4th day, Arthur finally managed to create a narrow passage into the interior of the house. It was a tight tunnel which he could barely crawl through, but it gave access to what appeared to have been the living room. The inside of the house was in surprisingly good condition. The ceiling had held up under the weight of the rubble, creating a kind of protected cave. There was mud and dampness, but the main structure was intact. Using a flashlight, Arthur explored the space. It was a simple house, with 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a small office. It was in this last room that he found what he was looking for. Lawrence's office was organized like that of a professional accountant. There was a metal filing cabinet with several drawers, a large desk with stacks of carefully organized documents, and several sealed boxes piled in a corner. Arthur opened one of the filing cabinet drawers. It was full of folders organized by year, each containing documents from the Granite Crest Mining Company. There were records dating back more than 20 years, including from the time when Sterling's father still ran the company. Comparing the old documents with the more recent ones, it became clear that the irregularities had begun shortly after Sterling took control. In the first years after his father's death, the records showed a prosperous and honest company. Then, gradually, suspicious transactions, ghost employees, and fund diversions began to appear. One specific folder caught his attention: retirement fund, irregularities. Inside were detailed spreadsheets showing how the money intended for employee pensions had been diverted to Sterling's personal accounts. Arthur discovered it wasn't just his own retirement that had been stolen. Sterling had created an elaborate scheme where he promised pensions to the senior employees, but never set aside the necessary money to pay those benefits. Instead, he used the money for personal investments and luxury purchases. When it came time to pay the pensions, he would simply fire the employees or create pretexts to cancel the benefits. In one of the sealed boxes, Arthur found something even more surprising: audio recordings. Lawrence had secretly recorded several conversations with Sterling where the businessman openly admitted his frauds and even discussed ways to solve the problem of the accountant who knew too much. One recording in particular made Arthur break out in a cold sweat. "Lawrence, you need to understand that business has changed. My father was sentimental, always worrying about employees and pensions. I think differently. If these old folks want a pension, let them go to the Social Security Administration." "But Mr. Sterling, the pension money has been deducted from their salaries for years. They have a right." "A right?" "Lawrence, a right is what's written in the contract. And I don't see any signed contract guaranteeing a pension for anyone. Sir, that's dishonest. That's business. And if you're not comfortable with the way I conduct my business, maybe you should retire too." The recording continued for a few more minutes, with Sterling making it clear that Lawrence had no choice but to accept the irregularities or suffer the consequences. Arthur found other equally incriminating recordings, where Sterling discussed bribing inspectors, falsifying environmental documents, and even plans to discourage employees who asked too many questions. As he examined the documents, he heard a noise from outside, voices and the sound of vehicles. Quickly he turned off the flashlight and stayed silent, trying to identify what was happening. Through the cracks in the tunnel he had created, he could see at least 2 cars parked in front of the property. One of them was Sterling's truck. From the other, 2 men he didn't know got out, wearing suits and looking professional. "Are you sure he's digging alone?" he heard Sterling ask. "Yes, sir. Our source confirmed he comes here every day and works late. But at the pace he's going, it'll take months to reach the house." "We can't wait months if he finds anything. Do you want us to stop him?" "Not like that. It would be too suspicious. Let's try other approaches first." Arthur stood motionless, barely breathing. Sterling was having him watched, and by the tone of the conversation, they weren't just curious onlookers, they were dangerous people. The voices faded away, but he remained hidden for another hour until he was sure they had left. When he finally risked coming out of the tunnel, he saw that someone had tampered with his tools and even overturned his tent. They were looking for something, or trying to intimidate him. That night, Arthur could hardly sleep. It was clear that Sterling knew he had found something, or at least suspected it, and the recordings he had discovered showed that his former boss would not hesitate to use questionable methods to protect his secrets. But giving up now would be a betrayal not only of himself, but of all the employees who had been robbed over the years. Lawrence had risked his own life to preserve this evidence. He couldn't just ignore it. On the 5th day, he decided to change his strategy. Instead of continuing to dig during the day when he could be observed, he began working at night. It was harder and more dangerous, but at least he would have privacy to examine the rest of the documents. During the day, he pretended to be discouraged and thinking of quitting. He even mentioned to Aunt Flo that he was considering selling the property. "It's too much work for one man," he said, loud enough for anyone who might be watching to hear. "You tried, son." "No one can say you didn't try," replied Aunt Flo, who seemed genuinely worried about his state of mind. But at night, when he was sure he wasn't being observed, he returned to Lawrence's office and continued cataloguing the evidence. It was during one of these nighttime sessions that he made his most important discovery. In a secret drawer of the filing cabinet, he found a detailed map of the region with several red markings. Along with the map, there was a list of coordinates and a note. "Backup locations. Use only in case of emergency." Lawrence hadn't kept all the evidence just in the house. He had created backup hiding spots at various points in the region, burying copies of the most important documents. One of the points marked on the map was only 200 meters from the house, near a waterfall Arthur had noticed during his walks through the area. In the early hours of the following morning, he followed the coordinates and found the first hiding spot. It was a box similar to the one he had found in the house, buried half a meter deep in an area protected by stones. Inside were not only documents, but also keys and addresses for safety deposit boxes at local banks, where Lawrence had stored the most damning evidence. Arthur began to understand the magnitude of what he had discovered. Lawrence had created such a complete safety net that it would be practically impossible for all the evidence to be destroyed or lost. But he also realized he was in a very dangerous situation. If Sterling discovered he had found not just documents, but also the locations of the hiding spots, his life could be at risk. During the 6th day, he pretended to be even more discouraged. He even talked with Aunt Flo about Sterling's offer to buy the land. $10,000 isn't a lot of money, she said. But if you're tired... It's just that I don't know what else to do, Aunt Flo. Maybe it's better to accept reality and try to rebuild my life another way. The important thing is that you tried, my boy. No one can criticize you for that. But at night, he continued exploring Lawrence's hiding spots. At the second location, he found photographs. Lawrence had visually documented many of the irregularities, pictures of employees being unfairly dismissed, images of documents being altered, even photos of Sterling in meetings with people who clearly weren't legitimate company employees. One photo in particular caught his attention. It showed Sterling handing an envelope full of money to a man Arthur recognized. It was Trevor, the company's security supervisor. The photo had been taken in Sterling's office, and the date on the back indicated it was from just 3 months prior. Trevor was the man responsible for accompanying problematic employees. Whenever someone complained too much about late wages or working conditions, Trevor would appear to talk with the person. Now Arthur understood that these talks were actually threats funded by Sterling himself. On the 7th day, something happened that completely changed the situation. Martha appeared in the mountains, accompanied by the lawyer, Mr. Victor Bennett. "Arthur, we need to talk," she said, visibly worried. "What is it?" "Mr. Bennett has discovered some things about the company, serious things." The lawyer opened his briefcase and took out some documents. "Mr. Arthur, I managed to access the company's official records through a contact at the Labor Court. I discovered that Granite Crest Mining is in serious financial trouble. It owes millions in taxes, has dozens of ongoing labor lawsuits, and what's worse, it's being investigated by the District Attorney's Office for fraud." "Fraud?" "Embezzlement, tax evasion, misappropriation of employee funds. The company could be shut down at any moment." Martha held her husband's hand. "Arthur, if the company closes, there will be nothing left for us. No pension, no severance, nothing." Arthur looked at the two of them, then at the pile of rubble where he knew the evidence that could solve everything was hidden. "Mr. Bennett, if I had proof of this fraud, would it be possible to recover the stolen money?" "Of course. But we would need very solid evidence, and it would have to be soon, before the company declares bankruptcy and hides its assets." "What kind of evidence?" "Accounting documents, transaction records, contracts. Anything that proves there was intentional diversion of funds meant for the employees." Arthur looked at Martha, then at the lawyer, and made a decision that would change everything. "I have that evidence." "What do you mean?" "Would you believe me if I said I found documents proving all of this buried here on this land?" Victor and Martha exchanged looks of disbelief. "Arthur, are you okay?" asked Martha, concerned. "I'm great. Actually, I'm better than I've been in years." He stood up and walked toward the tunnel he had dug. "Do you want to see the evidence?" "Arthur, there's nothing buried there but rubble," said Mr. Bennett gently. "Then come with me." Arthur led them through the tunnel to Lawrence's office. When he turned on the flashlight and Martha saw the preserved interior of the house, she let out a gasp of surprise. "How is this possible?" The house's structure held, and the man who lived here was an accountant for Granite Crest Mining. He discovered the fraud and hid the evidence before the landslide. Mr. Bennett examined the documents with growing astonishment. As an experienced lawyer, he immediately recognized the quality and authenticity of the evidence. "Mr. Miller, this is enough to sue not only the company but Sterling personally. These documents prove crimes that could result in prison time." And the pension money? With this evidence, we can get an immediate freeze on the company's and Sterling's assets. The stolen money can be recovered and distributed among the wronged employees. Martha hugged her husband, finally understanding why he had been so stubborn about not giving up the excavation. But how did you know there was something here? At first I didn't, but the more I dug, the stranger things got. And when Sterling came here trying to convince me to sell the land, I was sure there was something he didn't want me to find. Mr. Bennett was photographing the documents with his phone. I need to get all this to the office as soon as possible. With evidence like this, I can get a court order to freeze the company's assets this very week. Doctor, there's something you need to know, said Arthur. Sterling is watching me. Yesterday I saw men going through my things, and I'm sure they know I found something. Then we need to act fast. If he suspects you have evidence, he might try to destroy it or even intimidate you into staying quiet. Or worse, added Martha, remembering the recordings where Sterling discussed ways to resolve problems. Do you think I should leave here? For now, yes, said Mr. Bennett. We'll store all the evidence in a safe place and start the legal proceedings. When we have the protective orders, you can come back. Arthur agreed. He had found what he was looking for, and now it was time to use these discoveries wisely. They spent the rest of the day cataloguing and photographing all the documents they found. Mr. Bennett was impressed with the organization and completeness of the evidence Lawrence had preserved. This accountant was a very smart man, commented the lawyer. He created an evidence protection system that would be hard to beat, even for legal professionals. And what happened to him? From what I saw in the documents, he simply disappeared a few days before the landslide. There's no record of death, or of a change of address. It's as if he vanished. Do you think Sterling— It's better not to speculate about that now, interrupted Mr. Bennett. The important thing is to use this evidence to get justice for the crimes we can prove. At the end of the day, they sealed the access tunnel to the house again, so no one would suspect what had been found. Arthur took down his tent and said goodbye to Aunt Flo. So you're really going to sell the land? Asked the old woman. For now, I'm going back to the city, but I'm not going to sell. This place has become very important to me. Be careful, son. I still think there are strange things happening around here. Don't worry, Aunt Flo, and thank you for everything. Back in the city, Arthur, Martha, and Mr. Bennett worked through the night organizing the evidence and preparing the legal petitions. The attorney contacted other colleagues specializing in financial crimes, and together they drafted a comprehensive strategy to recover as much of the stolen money as possible. We'll attack on multiple fronts, explained Mr. Bennett, a collective labor lawsuit to recover the pensions, a criminal action against Sterling for the financial crimes, and a request to freeze assets to ensure the money doesn't disappear. How long will it take? If all goes well, we could have the first rulings in 2 weeks, but the full process could take months. What if Sterling finds out what we're doing? That's why we'll maintain absolute secrecy until the moment we file the lawsuits. Not even other company employees can know to avoid leaks. The next morning, Arthur woke up feeling different for the first time in months, no longer like a victim, but like someone who had discovered the truth and could now fight for justice. Martha was also more upbeat. You know I was wrong to want you to give up on that excavation? You were worried about me. It was natural. But your stubbornness is what saved us. If you hadn't insisted on digging, we never would have uncovered the fraud. It's not over yet, Martha. Sterling won't give up easily. As if guessing Arthur's thoughts, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello? Arthur, it's Sterling. I need to speak with you urgently. Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling. Look, I was thinking about our conversation about the land. How about if I raise the offer to $20,000? It's a very good offer for land in that condition. 20,000. Sterling had doubled the offer in just a few days. It was further confirmation that he was desperate to regain control of that land. That's an interesting proposal, said Arthur, trying to buy time. Great. We can close the deal today. I can come by your house with the papers. To my house? Yes. I have your address here in the company files. 342 Gardenia Street, right? A chill ran down Arthur's spine. Sterling knew where he lived, which meant he was being investigated more deeply than he had imagined. Mr. Sterling, I'd prefer to think about it a little more. It's a lot of money. I want to be sure I'm making the right decision. Of course, of course. But don't take too long. This kind of opportunity doesn't come around often. I understand. Oh, and Arthur, I hope you haven't found anything interesting during your excavations. It would be a shame if you got involved with things you don't understand. The threat was clear, though veiled. No, sir, just dirt and stone, really. Good. Then talk to you soon. Arthur hung up the phone with trembling hands. Martha, who had listened to the conversation, was pale. He knows where we live, and he's trying to intimidate us, but that only confirms we're on the right track. Mr. Bennett, who had arrived during the call, heard the account and grew concerned. I'll speed up the procedures. We can't wait 2 weeks. We'll file the lawsuits tomorrow. Is it safe? With the evidence we have, yes. Even if he suspects something, he won't have time to hide all the assets or destroy the evidence in the banks. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. That afternoon, Mr. Bennett returned to the office accompanied by 2 other attorneys and a forensic accountant. Together, they worked to organize all the evidence so it could be presented to the court as effectively as possible. Meanwhile, Arthur and Martha tried to maintain a normal routine so as not to arouse suspicion. Martha returned to her sewing work, and Arthur went out to look for temporary employment, as anyone in his situation would. But even while trying to appear normal, Arthur noticed he was being followed. During his walk through town, he realized the same black car appeared at several points along his route. He decided to test his suspicion. He went into a bakery, ordered a coffee, and watched through the window. The black car stopped across the street, and the driver waited, disguising his surveillance by pretending to read a newspaper. When Arthur left the bakery and headed in the opposite direction of his home, the car immediately followed him. There was no more doubt he was being professionally watched. He used a tactic he had seen in movies. He entered a mall, went up to the 2nd floor, took the elevator down on the opposite side, and exited through a different entrance. He managed to shake the surveillance and returned home by an alternate route. When he arrived, he found Martha crying in the kitchen. What happened? They called here. A man's voice, saying you should stop playing archaeologist if you wanted the family to stay safe. Arthur felt anger rise, but also fear. Now the threats were being directed straight at his wife. Martha, I think it's best you stay at your sister's house for a few days. I'm not leaving you alone. Please, just until we sort this out legally. I don't want you taking risks because of my decisions. Your decisions? Arthur, this isn't your fault. You discovered we were robbed and you're trying to get our rights back. I know, but no buts. If I'm leaving the house, you're leaving too. We'll stay at my sister's together. Arthur agreed. It really was safer. That night they packed some clothes and went to the house of Brenda, Martha's sister, who lived in a different part of town. Brenda was a strong woman in her 50s, who had raised 3 children alone after being widowed. When she learned of the situation, she immediately offered help. You can stay here as long as you need, and if those thugs show up here, they'll have to deal with me too. The next morning, Mr. Bennett called with important news. We managed to file all the motions last night. The judge has already signed the asset freeze injunction, and the State Bureau of Investigation has been authorized to investigate the financial crimes. And now? Now we wait. Sterling will be notified today, and all assets of the company and related individuals will be frozen. He won't be able to move money or sell properties anymore. And our safety? With the official proceedings underway, threats against you become even more serious crimes. I'll speak with the detective in charge of the case to ensure they pay special attention to your security. Around midday, Arthur received a furious call from Sterling. What the hell have you done, Arthur? Good morning, Mr. Sterling. Don't give me good morning. My lawyers told me you're suing me. What's this all about? I'm just seeking my rights, sir. Your rights? What rights? You worked for me for 17 years and were well paid for it. And my retirement that was promised? What retirement? We never signed anything about retirement. I have evidence that the retirement money was diverted, Mr. Sterling. There was a long silence on the line. What evidence? You'll find out during the proceedings. Arthur, you don't know who you're messing with. I can ruin your life in many ways. I'm recording this call, Mr. Sterling, and it will be given to the detective in charge of the case." Sterling hung up abruptly. Mr. Bennet had instructed Arthur to record all conversations with Sterling, predicting the businessman would lose his composure and further incriminate himself. During the afternoon, Mr. Bennet called again. "We secured a major victory. The judge authorized the opening of the bank vaults listed in Lawrence's documents. They found even more evidence there." "What kind of evidence?" "Contracts for ghost employees, receipts for suspicious payments, and best of all, documents showing Sterling knew you would uncover the fraud." "How so?" "There's a handwritten note from him saying A. Miller, risk of discovering accountant's documents, monitor." It was dated 3 days before he gave you the keys to the house. Arthur was stunned. Sterling had planned it all. He gave him the buried house, hoping he would excavate and find the documents so he could later frame him somehow or use the discovery to blackmail Lawrence if the accountant was still alive. "But that doesn't make sense. Why would he give me the exact house where the evidence was?" "Because he thought you could never excavate it alone. And if you did, he could claim you trespassed on the property or planted false evidence. It was a very elaborate plan to discredit any discovery, and if it didn't work, then he would use other methods, as we're seeing now with the threats." In the following days, the case gained momentum. Other former employees of Granite Crest Mining began seeking out Mr. Bennet to join the lawsuit. With each testimony, it became clear the fraud scheme was even bigger than imagined. Clarence, Arthur's brother, was one who came forward. "Arthur, I always suspected something was wrong at that company. When he fired me, he said it was for cost-cutting, but he kept hiring new people for lower wages. Why did you never tell me? I thought you wouldn't believe me. You were always so loyal to your job." "Too loyal," admitted Arthur. Gladys, who had worked as a cleaner at the company for 12 years, also came forward. "Mr. Arthur, I saw a lot of strange things there. Secret meetings, documents being burned in the backyard, strange people going in and out of the boss's office. And why did you never report it? Who would believe a cleaner against a rich businessman? But now that you've had the courage to stand up to him, I want to tell everything I know." The testimonies piled up, creating an increasingly clear picture of Sterling's criminal practices. Mr. Bennet was impressed with the amount of evidence that kept emerging. It seems half the town knew something was wrong, but no one had the courage to speak. "Or didn't have enough evidence," added Arthur. 1 week after the lawsuit began, Mr. Bennet received a call that would change everything again. "Mr. Arthur, I need you to come to my office immediately. Something extraordinary has happened." "What is it?" "I'd rather explain in person, and bring your wife. She'll want to hear this." At the lawyer's office, Arthur and Martha found an elderly man they didn't know. He was about 70, with white hair, very thin, and wore simple but clean clothes. "Mr. Arthur, this is the person I want you to meet," said Mr. Bennet. "Lawrence Harrison." Arthur nearly fell out of his chair. "Lawrence Harrison? The accountant? But wasn't he dead? Missing?" The old man smiled sadly. "No, young man. Just hidden." "Hidden where?" "In various places, but mainly in a small town in rural Georgia where I have a distant cousin. When I discovered Sterling was planning to eliminate me, I decided to fake my own death and disappear until it was safe to return." "But why come back now?" "Because I heard someone had found my documents and was using them to seek justice. I couldn't let another brave man fight Sterling alone." Mr. Bennet was beaming. "With Lawrence's testimony, our case has become irrefutable. He can personally confirm everything in the documents, and he has even more information that wasn't in the files." "What information?" asked Martha. Lawrence opened a small briefcase he had brought. "During the years I worked for the company, I made copies of everything. Not just the official documents, but also conversations, meetings, decisions that were made in secret. When I realized Sterling was becoming dangerous, I started recording everything." He pulled an old recorder and several cassette tapes from the briefcase. "I have over 50 hours of incriminating recordings here. Sterling had no idea I was documenting everything." "Why did you do this?" "Because I worked 32 years for his father, an honest and just man. When I saw the son destroying everything his father had built, I couldn't stay silent, but I also knew it would be dangerous to confront him directly. And why did you hide the documents in your house? Because I knew that one day someone would find them. The house was purposely left so that some honest employee would receive it. I influenced that decision a few months before I disappeared. How? I spoke with some of the company's long-time employees, told them about your qualities as a loyal and dedicated worker. I knew if you received the house, you'd be stubborn enough to dig, and honest enough to use the evidence the right way. Arthur was moved. Everything had been planned by Lawrence so that justice would be done. But Mr. Lawrence, why didn't you go to the police directly? Because Sterling has influential friends, police chiefs, judges, politicians. If I had shown up with the evidence, it could have disappeared, or I could have had an accident. It was safer to let the evidence be discovered by an outsider, someone Sterling would underestimate. Mr. Bennett intervened, and it worked perfectly. With Lawrence as a living witness and all these additional recordings, Sterling has no way out now. What happens now? Asked Martha. Now we make things right, replied Lawrence. All the employees who were wronged will receive what they're owed, and Sterling will answer for the crimes he committed. That night, Arthur could barely sleep. In just 2 weeks, his life had completely changed. From a humiliated and deceived employee, he had become the man who discovered and exposed a criminal scheme that harmed dozens of people. But more important than that, he had proven to himself that his persistent and stubborn nature, which Martha had so often criticized, was actually his greatest strength. The next day, Mr. Bennett organized a meeting with all the former company employees who had joined the lawsuit. The room was packed, almost 40 people who had been harmed by Sterling's practices. Lawrence told his story to everyone, explaining how he had discovered the fraud and why he had disappeared. Many employees were moved hearing the account. I always knew Mr. Lawrence was an honest man, said Gladys. When he disappeared, I was very sad, thinking something bad had happened to him. It did, replied Lawrence. I had to give up my normal life, my home, my friends. I lived like a fugitive for years, but it was worth it, because now the truth can be known. Mr. Bennett explained the next steps of the process. With the evidence we have, Sterling's conviction is practically certain. He will be prosecuted for fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and threats. The sentence could be up to 15 years in prison. And the money? Asked a former employee. His assets are already frozen. We found bank accounts with over $3 million, several properties, luxury cars. Everything will be auctioned and the money distributed among you, proportionally to what each is owed. $3 million? Arthur was impressed. That's just what we've been able to trace so far. There could be more. Clarence, Arthur's brother, asked the question on everyone's mind. What if he tries to flee the country? We've already requested his passport be blocked, and with the media attention this case is getting, it would be very difficult for him to hide anywhere. Indeed, the local papers had begun covering the case. Employee uncovers $1 million fraud at mining company was the headline in the region's main newspaper. The story of Arthur and his determination to excavate the buried house had captured the public's imagination. Reporters sought Arthur for interviews, but Mr. Bennett advised him not to speak to the press until the legal process was over. It's better to let the facts speak for themselves. Any statement could be used against us. 2 weeks later came the news everyone was waiting for. Sterling had been arrested. The arrest happened early in the morning at the luxurious house he lived in an upscale neighborhood of the city. According to the papers, he offered no resistance, but showed no remorse either. Mr. Bennett called to give Arthur the news. It's a preventive detention, but with the evidence we have, he's unlikely to get bail. And now? Now we begin the phase of quantifying the damages and organizing the restitution of the stolen money. It may take a few months, but you will receive everything you're entitled to. Arthur finally felt safe enough to return to his own home. The threats had stopped after Sterling's arrest, and life was beginning to return to normal. But there was one thing he still needed to do. He went back to the Blue Ridge Mountains, this time accompanied by Martha and Lawrence. The elderly accountant wanted to revisit his old house and see for himself how it had been preserved beneath the rubble. Aunt Flo was moved to see Lawrence alive. Mr. Lawrence, I thought I'd never see you again. Everyone thought you had... I know, Aunt Flo, I'm sorry for worrying everyone, but it was the only way to keep myself safe. And now, will you come back to live here? Lawrence looked at the pile of rubble covering his old house. No, Aunt Flo. That chapter of my life is over. I'm going to live with a niece in Charleston, but I'll always keep good memories of this place. And the house? Asked Arthur. The house is yours now by right. You fought for it, you earned it. But Mr. Lawrence, I can't imagine living in a house that was yours. Arthur, that house served its purpose. It was a hiding place for the evidence and a test to find the right person to use it. Now it can be a symbol of honesty's victory over corruption. Martha, who had remained silent, made a suggestion. What if we cleaned up the house and turned it into a kind of memorial, a place where people can remember that it's worth fighting for your rights? The idea pleased everyone. Lawrence was especially moved. It would be an honor to have my old house serve to inspire others to be brave. In the following months, as the legal proceedings continued, Arthur organized cleanup crews for the house. Several former company employees volunteered to help, turning the work into a kind of collective celebration. With proper tools and many people working, the cleanup was much faster than Arthur had imagined when he started alone. In 2 weeks, the house was completely cleared. The structure had withstood the burial well. With some repairs, it became habitable again. Mr. Bennett suggested they create a small NGO to manage the memorial and help other workers facing similar situations. You could use some of the money recovered in the lawsuit to fund the organization. It would be a way to ensure other frauds like this one would be uncovered and punished. The idea was accepted by everyone involved in the process. The Lawrence Harrison Foundation, Defense of Workers' Rights, was officially created 6 months later. Sterling's trial happened almost a year after his arrest. Arthur was present in the courtroom, along with Lawrence and several other former employees. The businessman who was once arrogant and mocking now seemed like a broken man. His lawyers tried to argue that he had no criminal intent, that they were just accounting errors, but the evidence was irrefutable. Lawrence testified for over 3 hours, detailing how he discovered the fraud and how he was threatened when he tried to report it internally. Arthur also gave a statement, telling how he received the buried house and how his determination to dig led to the discovery of the evidence. The judge at the end of the trial was clear in his sentence. The defendant, Sterling Vance, is guilty of embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion, and threats. The crimes were committed in a systematic and premeditated manner, harming dozens of honest workers. The sentence is 12 years in a closed prison, plus a fine of $5 million. When the sentence was read, several former employees cried with emotion. Finally, justice had been served. The recovered money was distributed among all the victims. Arthur received not only his full Social Security benefits, but also substantial compensation for the years of exploitation. With part of the money, he and Martha bought a new house in the city. With another part, they invested in the Lawrence Harrison Foundation, which quickly became a regional reference in defending workers' rights. The house in the Blue Ridge Mountains was turned into the Persistence Memorial, a place where school groups and workers visit to learn the story of how the determination of a simple man exposed a corruption scheme and restored dignity to dozens of families. Lawrence, despite his advanced age, became a kind of mentor for the foundation, sharing his experience with young lawyers and accountants interested in fighting corporate corruption. 2 years after the story began, Arthur was standing in the same spot where he had once received the keys to a buried house as a humiliation. Now that place was a symbol of victory and hope. Martha was by his side, as were Lawrence, Mr. Bennett, and dozens of people whose lives had been transformed by the discovery of the evidence hidden in the rubble. Sometimes I think how different our life would be if I had given up that first day, Arthur commented to Martha. But you didn't give up. Your stubbornness, which I criticize so much, is what saved us. It wasn't just stubbornness, Lawrence interjected. It was courage. Courage to fight for what is right, even when everyone says it's impossible. And now, asked Martha, what do we do with so much victory? Arthur looked around, seeing the faces of the people who had benefited from the fight that began with a simple excavation. Now we help other people discover that they too can fight for their rights, that they can be stubborn when the cause is just. Mr. Bennett, who had become a close friend of the family, smiled, and that there are still many buried houses out there waiting for someone brave enough to dig and uncover the truth. The foundation grew and expanded to other cities. In 5 years, it had helped recover over $10 million in denied labor rights and successfully prosecuted dozens of dishonest businessmen. Arthur became a respected figure in the region, sought out by workers facing situations similar to the one he had lived through. His story was told in schools, unions, and even universities as an example of how individual perseverance can bring about collective change. Sterling served his full sentence. When he got out of prison, he was a bankrupt and discredited man. He tried to rebuild his life in another city, but the fallout from the case followed him wherever he went. Lawrence lived to be 85, long enough to see the foundation bearing his name help hundreds of workers. At his funeral, Arthur gave a moving speech. Lawrence taught us that sometimes you have to disappear for the truth to appear, that you must sacrifice your personal comfort for justice to be done. And that courage isn't about not being afraid, but about doing what's right even when you are afraid. Martha, now a grandmother of 2, would tell the children the story of how Grandpa Arthur dug a house under the ground and found a treasure greater than gold. "What treasure, Grandma?" the children would ask. "The treasure of justice, my dears, the treasure of knowing we did what was right." Aunt Flo, who lived to be 90, became the unofficial guardian of the Persistence Memorial. She would greet visitors with the same kindness as always, sharing details of the story that only she had witnessed from the beginning. "Young Arthur arrived here with nothing but the clothes on his back," she would tell groups of students. "But he had something no money could buy, determination, and it was that determination that changed everyone's life." The memorial received over 1,000 visitors a year. School groups, universities, unions, and even business owners who wanted to better understand workers' rights. At the entrance, there was a plaque with the inscription, "Dedicated to all who have the courage to dig deep to find the truth." And in Lawrence's preserved office, kept exactly as it was found, there was a framed quote that became the Foundation's motto, "The persistence of one honest person can be more powerful than all the wealth of a corrupt one." Arthur, at 60, still visited the memorial regularly, not out of nostalgia, but to remind himself and others that small individual actions can have enormous consequences when motivated by justice. Once, a young journalist asked if he had imagined that digging up that house would change so many lives. "No," Arthur answered honestly, "I just wanted to reclaim my dignity. But I discovered that when you fight for your dignity honestly, you end up reclaiming the dignity of many people. And if you could go back in time, would you do it all the same?" Arthur looked at the house that was once buried and now welcomed hundreds of people seeking inspiration. "I would do it all the same, but I would start digging sooner." End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story of overcoming and determination. Do you know any worker who also fought for their rights like Arthur? Leave your opinion in the comments and share your own experiences. If this story moved you, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Your participation is very important to us.